EDP, the Portuguese energy company, CEO of EDP. Welcome, Miguel. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
On the Davos Daily Show. So I suppose just a broad question to start off, because these are difficult times for lots of companies, but the energy sector is in all sorts of pressures applying. How do you see the current state of the sector from your perspective?
It's certainly a very exciting time to be in the sector. We're seeing sort of quite a few changes. On one hand, you're seeing a huge growth in demand for the first time in almost decades, where it's basically been flat or declining demand. So both in Europe and in the US, you started to see that begin to take off, driven very much by AI, digital, sort of the data centers boom. You're continuing to see a lot of build out of renewables. It's the fastest technology. It's also the most affordable one in most countries. And so certainly in Europe, you're continuing to see that growth. But strangely enough, also in the US. So it's a very fast technology to deploy, and you're seeing sort of all the big tech sort of suck up all of that power in those projects. And so solar and batteries, we continue to see that growing over the next couple of years. And then we also see a huge growth in networks, because that's really one of the big enablers for this growth in generation, and also to connect all of these new consumers. So for example, just in our networks business, we're going to have a 70% increase in investment over the next 5 years versus the previous 5 years. So we really have this sort of very material step up investment in networks.
And I mean, to what degree is that building new equipment and putting new things in the ground versus actually upgrading existing systems that might be put under strain?
It's a great question. I think the big part of the investment in networks is modernization. Sort of really, a lot of it was built 40 years, 40, 50 years ago, and so it's getting to the end of their useful life. So there's a certain amount that is modernization and just substituting the existing equipment. But there is also a lot of investment in actual new connections, both for demand, sort of new consumers like the data centers and industrial projects, and also for producers. Renewables is much more distributed, and so you really have to connect up all of these different projects to make sure that we have this supply-demand balance.
I mean, are you confident that this can be done in time? Because the scale of electrification and the pace of it is so huge, everything from EVs to AI, as you say. It's a big ask for a lot of, not to be rude, but traditional utilities.
Yeah. Well, first, I think the pace has been growing over the years, but we're now seeing a step change. I think we are ready to do it. We have the resources, we have the capital. I think the biggest frustration that we and many in the sector share is really the issues around licensing and permitting for some of these projects. For example, for many renewable projects, it will take 4 to 6 years to license them, and then it'll take 12 to 18 months to build them. So you can see this sort of mismatch between the amount of time it takes to license versus actually building it and getting it done. So we have been working very much with governments and with regulators to try to streamline these processes so they can actually move faster. I think that's one of the big restrictions that we see. Because apart from that, as I say, we have the capital, we have the technologies, we have the resources. It's a question just of scaling it up and getting the permits to be able to move forward.
I mean, in territories where you're working, do you find there's local resistance as well from householders and others who are kind of seeing these renewable plants and data centers and other kind of stuff being built next door to them?
I mean, I think infrastructure projects always have this issue about having some backlash from local communities, or at least, and I think that's why it's so important to actually work with the local communities so they feel they're getting something out of it. Not just jobs, but potentially even some benefit, for example, in terms of either local taxes or, for example, reductions in their electricity bills. So keeping the local communities is incredibly important. Having said that, Europe, after the energy crisis in 2022, they introduced this concept of overriding public interest, which means that these projects are at the level of national security.
Yes.
We need to become more independent energetically, and so you need to be able to push these projects forward, and obviously working with the local communities, but they shouldn't get bogged down, for example, in courts and things with local opposition. And so, for example, Germany is a good place where you've actually seen that implemented, and you've really seen sort of the pace of growth really take off.
Yes. Just to stick with AI, obviously you've mentioned the huge demand that AI data centers would put on the grid and on the system. But AI can also be used to try and forecast, alleviate, and shape demand.
Yep.
Tell us a bit about how you're using it actually to try and offset some of the pressures.
So we see tremendous opportunities there. AI, not just in terms of becoming more efficient as a company, so using it to, whether it's to automate certain processes or to actually accelerate some of those processes. But as you say, also in terms of actually planning better the network, planning better the meteorology. I mean, EDP as a company, we're over 90% of our generation is renewable, either hydro, wind, or solar. So being able to predict what's going to happen in terms of the weather over the next couple of days or weeks is critical in terms of managing our network and managing also our assets. So everything to do with sort of being able to plan better and to optimize and to use our existing infrastructure better with using AI is good. So on the revenue side and both on the cost side.
Right.
As well.
So talking about the grid, obviously last year was, if you like, dominated from a news point of view by the big Iberian outage, which seemed like a wake-up call, to use the old cliche, for everybody involved in power companies everywhere, not just on the Iberian Peninsula, but EDP in particular, I imagine. What has been the kind of consequence of that? What can you do to reassure us and consumers of yours that this won't happen again, and that you're doing things to mitigate that possibility?
So that blackout originated in the south of Spain, and then it sort of cascaded through Spain and basically knocked down their electricity system. And then at the time, Portugal was importing 30% of its power from Spain, and so when Spain went down, Portugal also went down simultaneously. And so you had this sort of total blackout. I think the consequences are that this idea that you need to think about resilience of the system more. And the pendulum had swung probably too much to the area of efficiency on the side of governments and regulators, so really pushing for cost reductions and sort of optimization to the limit. And now this realization that you need to spend actually some money to make the systems more resilient, which means having more sophistication to manage the network, more things like ancillary services, so batteries to provide some of the backup, managing better the voltages and the frequencies on the system. And so overall, I think there's been a rethinking about how to make sure that those systems are more resilient, the power system is more resilient, so we don't have a repetition of that situation.
Because as I understand it, sort of renewables need to have sort of, if you like, built-in safeguards to prevent their kind of fluctuations there knocking the system out, something that's not the case with gas-powered generators, for example.
But this wasn't a case of renewables. This was really an issue around the management of the network by the system operator. So the voltage levels, they were operating too close to the limit. There was some disturbance in the network, and that sort of triggered a domino effect, which then all the different power stations, both thermal and renewables, started being knocked off the system in a sequence, and there wasn't sufficient redundancy in the system to sort of stop that.
Right.
I think now the system is operating in a more conservative manner, and so we probably won't have a repetition of that. But I think there were a lot of lessons learned about how to manage the system better.
Were you happy with the way in which the Spanish dealt with the aftermath of the crisis there?
Yes, I think the authorities in general. So I think the first thing to say is that obviously very unfortunate situation, but the recovery was actually very good. And I think it was recognized even internationally that actually, we had most of the customers back on within the space of 10 to 12 hours. So fortunately that, there was no sort of major crises or issues. I think in general, those lessons have been learned. There's still the final report that's going to come out from ENTSO, which is sort of the European sort of System Operators Association, that will sort of hopefully clarify once and for all exactly what are the root cause issues and how we should address them.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about innovation in energy. Obviously, as you've already mentioned, you have large renewables portfolio. What are the new areas that even go beyond what we already understand as solar and wind turbines and hydro power? Where is EDP working now to say, okay, we need to even start thinking about a next generation of clean energy?
Well, first I just say that those are mature technologies, and so really the challenge there is scaling them up.
Yes.
Because for the reasons I mentioned, that there's a lot of space still to grow them. I think batteries is definitely an area which is becoming more mature. The costs continue to come down, the efficiency continues to increase, and that's going to be a very important complement to the other renewable technologies. So being able to manage then that sort of excess energy which is sometimes produced and sort of displacing it to other times of the day. But I'm also very excited actually about sort of the software side of it, sort of the digital side of things. We were just talking a little while ago about managing using AI to manage the system better. I think there's a lot of innovation happening there, and so I'm very sort of optimistic, I think, and motivated, I think, to really see how we can drive that to make the system better, so it can be more affordable, more reliable for our consumers.
And where would you put us now in that sort of transition from fossil fuel to renewables? Because clearly it was looking like a straight path, quite a rapid path by energy standards, and then suddenly the Ukraine war broke out. We suddenly had a problem where we needed to find fossil fuel sources from elsewhere. Lots of people piled in to say, we're moving the energy transition too fast. But at the same time, it might have made people think we can't be as dependent on fossil fuels. Where would you say we are now, regrettably still with a war in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I think first, particularly in Europe, it's become very clear that we need to be more energy independent. We cannot be dependent on gas from Russia, but we shouldn't really be dependent on importing fossil fuels, or we should reduce our imports of fossil fuels as much as possible. I think that we've seen that energy can be weaponized, and so we should try to avoid that. The second thing is that competitiveness and affordability has also become much more relevant, I think, in also this world. And so the issue around sustainability, which is the third pillar of that sort of energy trilemma, it's still there, but I think these other two, energy independence and sort of affordability, have become more relevant, certainly over the last couple of years. So I think the energy transition is doing well. It continues to progress. I was mentioning before that you had basically flat demand, and so the growth in renewables was substituting thermal. I think now with the growth in demand, it's not so much about energy transition at the moment, it's more about energy addition.
Yes.
You're sort of having to add more energy, and sort of that additional energy that you need, that additional power that you need, is coming a lot from renewables. But yes, you are having to keep some of that existing installed base sort of still over the next couple of years.
Right, but in a way the pie is getting bigger.
The pie is getting bigger.
And a larger proportion of that is going to end up being renewables. Yep. I mean, the word resilience is constantly used in relation to energy and other things, and clearly we're in a very unstable area of geopolitically, and the volatility that's the Ukraine war has shown is, some people say, the sort of the new normal. How confident are you that the system that you're overseeing and helping to supply is up to the task?
So we're obviously very strong in Europe. We're operating in 12 different countries here, but Iberia is our primary focus, or at least where we have the biggest presence. But we have also half of our generation fleet, the renewable generation fleet, in the US.
Yes.
I'd say in terms of reliability, we feel very good about it. In terms of the geopolitics, I think we need to go on adapting to the new realities. But at the end of the day, the economics drive the adoption of a lot of these technologies. And that's, where we believe in the energy transition, not just because of the sustainability aspect of it, but very much because we think it's the most competitive and most affordable type of technology to implement. And so, despite the geopolitics and despite some of the rhetoric, we continue to see that sort of moving forward. And we've been able to adapt to those geopolitics over time. The war in Ukraine specifically, I mean, that energy crisis was a really exceptional issue, but we should be prepared for more volatility going forward. But that means that we need to have a more resilient system, which, as I say, if you have a more renewables, better grids, better software, better sort of management of the system, I think we can withstand pretty much any shocks. And I think you've seen that over time.
I mean, would you say that the attitude to green energy in the US and European markets where you work is less different than the rhetoric, the political rhetoric suggests?
Well, I'd say in the US we don't talk about green energy.
Right.
In the US we talk about jobs, value creation, cheap energy, and just having access to energy or power sort of in the short term. And those are the drivers. In Europe, we talk about the same things, but I think there the green aspect, the fact that it's clean, the fact that we are not, that it's reducing the need to import fossil fuels, I think that's also an additional, let's say, element there.
Yes. So you're tuning it to the different audiences. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it. Yes.
Because the realities are, the sentiment is also slightly different, but the actual, the US has a lot of oil and gas. So for them, the issues around independence of energy perhaps is not so relevant. So that's why the jobs element and the cheap energy is important. Europe doesn't have a lot of gas or oil. And so, that resiliency, being more independent, that is the bigger issue for Europe. Gas is also much more expensive in Europe than in the US. So the issue around affordability is also more important in Europe at the moment.
Right. We have a panel coming up tomorrow here about decarbonisation versus digitization, and we've set it up journalistically as a sort of opposition. Are these two objectives in opposition to each other, do you think? And what's the role of markets in trying to kind of square the circle?
Well, if you mean digitalization as in you're going to need a lot more computing power, so a lot more energy. I think, as I said, we need additionality. We need probably all of the above. But you still see the big tech, and you see a lot of the sort of the leading sort of tech companies continuing to procure renewable energy. First, it is competitive and cheap. It's very fast to access, in terms of time to market. There's a lot of talk about nuclear, but quite frankly, you won't get anything built in the next 5-10 years. So it's not going to solve your short, medium-term problem. Thermal, gas, yes, it's certainly a fuel that will be around for quite a while, but coal is being phased out in almost all the different countries. So it's maybe you can extend the life of existing power plants, but it's not going to build new ones. And so, yes, I think they are not in opposition at all. You're going to see a lot more build out of renewables driven by the digitalization, the need for more power quickly and sort of, in an affordable way. You mentioned nuclear there. Is nuclear, despite not being a short-term solution, is it the long-term solution, do you believe? Well, first, I think it'll depend very much on the country. Yeah. Some countries are completely opposed to nuclear, so that's not it's a political issue there. From a technology and cost perspective, we've seen that in many countries, it is much more expensive to build. And the UK, you have some good examples of how long it's taken to build some power plants like Hinkley and others, and the cost that has been associated with it. So I think there still needs to be a lot of work to bring down the cost of nuclear and to speed up the time it takes if you want to have it as a competitive source of power. But again, if you look at any of the independent projections, you see nuclear potentially keeping the same market share, maybe of a growing pie, but not really contributing to a growth in nuclear. Because remember, if renewable sometimes takes 4 to 6 years to license, and it's relatively straightforward technology. Licensing a nuclear power plant is not any easier, and building one is certainly not any faster. And you don't have, it doesn't sound like you hold out great hope for nuclear fusion, which might be a cleaner, or at least perceived as a cleaner nuclear option, coming to the rescue very soon. I'm an engineer, and I would love that to be an option and a solution. That would be fantastic, I think, for the world and for the society in general. But it's just one of those technologies that seems to be continuously being pushed out in terms of timing. So I would love it if we could actually make it work. But it doesn't, from everything that I see and read, doesn't seem like that's going to happen sort of any time in the next couple of decades. Yes. Let me ask you one final quick question about Davos as a gathering. What's the use of Davos? Why do you keep coming back to the World Economic Forum Summit? A couple of different reasons. One, I think you get to meet very interesting people and from very different sectors and different perspectives and different geographies. And so having around the table all these different views really gets you out of your day-to-day bubble, and I think that's very useful. I think it's also a great place to actually then be able to debate. You know, we have our point of view and our perspective on the world and on what's happening, and being able to offset that with those other diverse views and sort of getting a sense of what is sort of that collective thinking. You know, and so some of the discussions I think are extremely enriching. So I certainly take a lot out of it.
Miguel Stilwell and Andrade from EDP, thank you for coming on the Davos Daily Show.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
So welcome back to the Davos Daily Show. I'm Martin Wolf.